When a man truly opens himself in intimacy, have you ever stopped to wonder, what is it that he's really searching for? Because let's be honest, it's not just about sex. It's not just about skin on skin or the mechanical rhythm of bodies moving together. There's something much deeper unfolding, an invisible choreography, a secret language that speaks not just to the body, but to the soul. Even if many men can't put it into words, even if most have never truly noticed it happening. Society, culture, even mainstream psychology, often reduce male desire to a simple equation, impulse plus instinct, pleasure. But for anyone who's explored the depth of Jungian psychology, you know that's just the surface. That's the mask. What lies beneath is a world far richer, more mysterious and far more human. Every act of touch, every glance, every moment of surrender is rooted in something ancient, something buried. The masculine psyche carries within it 1,000 stories, some told, many, forgotten, most unconscious. And in the moment of true intimacy, when a man lets his guard down, even for a second, it's not just a physical act. It's an unveiling. It's a soft, trembling invitation into a space he rarely enters, even alone. Because let's face it, we live in a culture that demands men be strong, composed, unshakable, always certain, always in control. Vulnerability, that's not supposed to be part of the male script. But in those silent moments between breath and skin, the armor cracks. And what emerges isn't weakness, it's truth. What he longs for, what many men ache for without ever knowing how to say it, isn't just pleasure. It's acceptance, not for his performance, not for his body, but for who he is, with his fears, his wounds, his insecurities, the parts of him that don't fit the mold of the strong man. And that's the moment when intimacy transcends the physical. That's when it becomes something sacred. Because yes, the body is involved, but the soul is awakened. What happens in that moment can unearth truths that have been buried for years, sometimes decades, and the man may not even realize why he's trembling, not with fear, but with recognition, because something deep inside him is finally being seen. So I ask you, in your most honest view, what do you think a man truly seeks when he surrenders in intimacy? Let it settle. Reflect. And if you feel moved, write your answer in the comments, because your truth might just be the mirror someone else needs to look into. And if this type of deep inner reflection speaks to you, if it resonates on a level beyond logic, then go ahead and subscribe here to Unshakable Mind. This space is dedicated to exploring the human experience beneath the surface, to honoring the parts of us that the world often asks us to silence. Carl Jung once said something powerful. The unconscious does not speak in words. It speaks in images, in symbols, in gestures. And nowhere is this more true than in our intimate lives. The way we touch, the way we allow ourselves to be touched, the things that turn us on, the things that shut us down. Every impulse is a message, every reaction is the voice of something within us, something trying to be seen. Sometimes a gesture carries an entire story. Sometimes a silence holds a memory we've tried to forget. Sometimes a specific desire is the echo of an unmet emotional need. Most people never notice. They live these moments as though they're just instinctual. But they're not. They're deeply symbolic. And if we don't learn how to read the language, we'll keep repeating the same patterns over and over again. Intimacy, Jung would say, is a mirror, not in a romantic, dreamy way, but because it reflects who we are when we're not performing, when we drop the act and let the unconscious step forward. So ask yourself, why is it that in some relationships we feel safe, light, free, and in others, everything shuts down? Why do guilt, shame, and fear arise in certain moments of connection? These feelings don't come from nowhere. They're the result of past experiences, emotional wounds we never gave time to heal, beliefs we inherited, traumas we minimized. And here we touch on one of Jung's most essential truths. What we refuse to look at within ourselves will inevitably show up in our relationships, especially in intimacy, because the way we give ourselves to another person is a direct reflection of how we relate to our own soul. And there's something even more delicate, more nuanced in this exploration of male desire. It's something rarely spoken about with honesty, the quiet pleasure many men feel in giving pleasure. And no, we're not just talking about physical satisfaction. We're talking about something that borders on the spiritual. For many men, far more than are willing to admit, there's a genuine, soul-level joy in witnessing the other fully surrender, in watching someone else feel alive, safe, open, free. But what does that say about him? What's the real force behind this desire to please? According to Jung, every man carries within him a silent presence, a feminine essence he called the Anima. This isn't an external woman. It's not about gender or sexual orientation. It's the inner feminine, the part of the male psyche that is intuitive, empathic, nurturing, and emotionally attuned. When a man taps into this space, he accesses something beyond ego, beyond conquest. He steps into a realm where connection is more important than control, where the act of touch becomes sacred, not because it's erotic, but because it's honest. The Anima doesn't need applause. She doesn't need to win. She only needs to feel. And when a man allows her to speak through him, his intimacy becomes something rare, something healing, for himself and for those he shares it with. This is just the beginning. And we'll go deeper in the next part of this journey. Let's keep going. Listen closely. There is a kind of surrender that doesn't speak in words. When a man finds joy in giving pleasure, not just receiving it, something ancient and often forgotten begins to stir within him. Whether he realizes it or not, his actions may be echoing a deep inner reconnection to something he's lost over time. It's as if, in touching another, he is also reaching inward toward a self he abandoned long ago under the rubble of expectations, rigid roles, and the heavy armor of masculinity. But let's be clear, this experience is rarely conscious. Most men move through these moments without awareness, acting on impulses, repeating patterns, seeking approval, chasing an image of success, of being good enough. And yet, beneath all of that, there's a quieter, more vulnerable truth trying to be heard. The desire to be accepted, the longing to feel needed, the craving to find value in oneself that doesn't depend on anyone else's validation. And here's where it gets profound. When this desire arises not from neediness, not from emptiness, but from a genuine place of connection, it becomes sacred. It transforms from a pursuit of pleasure into something else entirely, an act of devotion, a sacred ritual, a wordless ceremony between souls who recognize each other, not through noise or performance, but through pure, silent presence. But let's not romanticize too quickly. That kind of purity isn't always present. In fact, it's rare. So it begs the question, where does your desire to please really come from? Is it an expression of love, or is it a mask, a cover, for something older, something more fragile, perhaps a buried fear? How often does what looks like generosity actually spring from desperation? How many men, without even realizing it, give so much in hopes of finally being chosen, being seen, being enough? How many confuse sacrifice with love, when what they're truly doing is begging not to be abandoned again? Carl Jung warned us not to blindly trust the surface of gestures. Not every act of care is love. Not every offering is selfless. Sometimes the man who gives the most is the one who is trying to fill the biggest void. He tries to be the best lover, the most attentive partner, the most present companion, not because he simply wants to give, but because he needs to be needed. He fears rejection, even if that rejection happened long ago, in childhood, in adolescence, or in a moment that left an invisible scar. And that's how, without even knowing it, many men end up in relationships that look deep, but are actually built on wounds. This doesn't make them bad, it just makes them human. But here's where the danger lies: when we don't question the automatic, when we repeat the same patterns over and over, when we seek in others what can only be found within. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And nowhere is this more evident than in our most intimate connections. Men who think they are loving, but are actually losing themselves. Men who believe they're caretakers, but are unknowingly punishing themselves through their own emotional neglect, because they still haven't turned inward, still haven't faced themselves with honesty. You see, the ego wants to be the best in bed, the most desired, the ideal partner. It craves applause, recognition, victory. But love, real love, needs no stage. It doesn't perform. It simply is. And to arrive in that space of true intimacy, one must walk through chaos first. The chaos of unresolved stories, the chaos of emotional absences that left imprints, of rejections that still echo in the background of your nervous system. Only through this inner journey, only by diving into the disorder within, can intimacy transform. It stops being a performance and becomes presence. It lets go of control and finds surrender. But this takes courage, because real intimacy requires us to look inside, to face our shadow, and every desire carries two faces, light and dark. The shadow is the part most of us don't want to deal with. We pretend it's not there. We deny it, repress it, bury it, but it always finds a way to surface, especially in moments of vulnerability, especially in bed, when the masks come off, when the body begins to speak the truths our mouths can't form. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is everything we've hidden from ourselves: the fears, the shame, the jealousy, the insecurities, the impulses that we were told were too much or not okay. We learned to sweep these parts under the emotional rug. They became the things we should never feel, never show, never admit. But here's the thing: human desire, especially sexual desire, doesn't obey moral rules. It doesn't follow the scripts we were given. It is one of the most powerful mirrors we have for our shadow self. Sometimes what arouses us also frightens us. Sometimes, in seeking connection, we reveal the very parts of ourselves we've tried so hard to hide. It's not uncommon for desire to be tangled up with control, with domination, with old needs to prove our worth or reclaim a sense of power we lost in childhood. And when that happens, it's not always visible, it's not always loud, it can be subtle, it can look like love, it can sound like affection, but beneath it is a longing to heal, a need to be whole. We'll go even deeper into the realm of the unconscious, the anima, and the emotional blueprint of masculine intimacy in the next chapter of this journey. Stay with me. But the shadow, she never truly disappears. She lingers in the corners. She speaks in the offhand comment that cuts too deep. She appears in the silence after intimacy, unexpected, hollow, confusing, even when everything seemed to go right. Carl Jung warned us, as long as the shadow is not brought to consciousness, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. How many times have you seen someone fall into the same kind of relationship over and over again? Different faces, same ending, same heartbreak, same emotional collapse. It feels like déjà vu, but it isn't coincidence. It's the unconscious running the script. In intimacy, this cycle can be especially brutal because it doesn't just touch our thoughts, it touches the parts of us that are rawest. The body, the longing to be accepted, the silent terror of not being desired, the deep-rooted fear of being emotionally abandoned. Again, when we don't face our shadow, we start blaming the other. Or worse, we blame ourselves for something we don't even understand. But here's the truth. The shadow doesn't need to be destroyed. It cannot be. It is part of you. What it needs is to be seen, to be acknowledged with both strength and compassion. Only then does intimacy stop being a battleground and start becoming a place of truth. Because real desire, when born from awareness, not from lack, doesn't need to prove itself. It doesn't feed on performance. It is grounded, present, human. According to Jung, there is within every man an invisible yet essential presence, the Anima. She is not a woman, she is not gender. She is the soul's feminine principle, the inner compass of emotion, sensitivity, intuition, creativity, and depth. But in so many cultures, this presence has been silenced. Boys are taught early, don't cry, don't feel too much, don't show weakness, be the strong one. Always. And what happens? He grows up cut off from himself, disconnected from his own emotional roots, carrying a hollow space inside he can't even name. And so, the hunger for intimacy begins, but not just physical intimacy. When a man approaches another, what truly moves toward the other is not just his body, it's his soul, reaching out for lost parts of himself. Often, unconsciously, he projects onto the other the very tenderness, care, and emotional depth he's been denied, or that he has denied himself. That's why some encounters feel so powerful. It's not just attraction, it's recognition. It's as if in the eyes of the other he catches a glimpse of the piece of himself he's forgotten, the tenderness, the safety, the permission to be soft. But that projection can become a trap, because what he's really searching for out there has always been in here. And if he doesn't realize this, he'll continue the search forever, always hoping someone else will fill the void, someone else will carry the burden. And in intimacy, the pattern repeats. The man idealizes the partner. He puts the weight of everything onto them: lover, mother, savior, safe haven. But no one can live up to that fantasy. No one can be everything. And when the image cracks, because it always does, what follows is disappointment, distance, pain. This hurts, but it also reveals a sacred truth. What he was yearning for was never just the other person. It was the forgotten part of himself, the one he exiled, the one he silenced. Intimacy in this light becomes an unconscious attempt to come back home. When Jung speaks of individuation, this is what he means: the journey of becoming whole, not perfect, not pure, whole. To not just know yourself, but to reunite with all of you, the light and the shadow, the logic and the chaos, the strength and the tenderness. To stop being a reflection of what others expect you to be, and start becoming who you truly are, fully, fearlessly, with soul. And let's talk about sexuality, because here lies one of the most misunderstood truths. Many treat sex as something separate from the emotional or spiritual self, as if it were just a physical act isolated from the rest of our inner world. But that's a lie. Sex, true, conscious, soul-connected sex, is one of the most direct channels into the psyche. Why? Because in the act of intimacy we appear with fewer defenses, less control, less script, less mask. And what emerges in that vulnerability is raw truth, in the silent touch, in the unscripted eye contact, in the way we hold or withhold our presence, all that we carry within us, our fears, our desires, our traumas, our unmet needs. They show up here, Some believe sex is separate from their emotional biography, but the truth is, it reveals that biography. It's written all over our bodies. That's why this space holds such tremendous power. Because when a man begins to engage with his sexuality, with presence, with curiosity, with listening, he sees himself differently. The act stops being escape. It stops being a performance. It becomes a mirror. It's no longer about proving anything, no longer about winning or being enough. It becomes about being, about feeling fully, about meeting yourself in the presence of another, and that changes everything. When a man is fully present, truly, deeply present, something shifts. He's not just performing. He's not calculating every move, every word, every breath. He's listening, not just to the other person, but to what's stirring within himself. In that state, the body stops being a mere tool for pleasure and becomes something far more profound. It becomes a bridge between the outer world and the inner one, between the self and the other, between instinct and emotion. Every touch becomes a doorway, every glance a key, not in some romanticized or idealized sense, but as a lived experience that demands maturity, responsibility, presence. And this path, it's not easy, because it asks a man to face truths he's spent years avoiding. It asks him to question what he was taught about masculinity, about desire, about love. It asks him to unlearn the myth that a man must always know, always lead, always dominate, but ironically it's in letting go of that need for control that he finally begins to find himself. And when that happens, sexuality stops being an unconscious loop of craving and performance and becomes an expression of the soul. There is something many men feel but rarely know how to name, a fear, not of failure, not of weakness, but of not being seen. And I don't mean being seen for your achievements or your image. I mean being seen for who you really are. That unspoken fear of moving through life invisible, not to the world, but to the people who matter. From a young age, many boys are taught to stay strong, to hold it in, to never show what hurts. And so, they start silencing emotion, swallowing tears, building a fortress out of stoicism. But over time, that armor gets heavy, really heavy. And the more a man hides what he feels, the more distant he becomes from himself. And that distance, it doesn't just stay buried. It creates an aching emptiness inside, a quiet hunger that often manifests as a need for emotional validation, not just to be admired for what he does, but to be accepted for what he feels, with all his contradictions, with all his doubts, with all his wounds. And it's in the intimate space, when the layers begin to fall away, that this need rises to the surface with full force. Desire at times carries more than attraction. It carries a whispered plea. See me, hear me, want me, for who I am. But because this plea isn't always conscious, it often hides behind other faces, neediness, pressure, performance. And when the other person doesn't respond the way he'd hoped, the spiral begins. Disappointment, withdrawal, not because he stopped caring, but because he felt invisible. Again, the need to be validated isn't weakness, it's human. But when it remains unconscious, it quietly takes the wheel. And many spend years trying to fill that inner void through relationships, not realizing that what's missing is not someone else, but a connection with themselves, that fear of invisibility. It doesn't dissolve through praise. It dissolves through presence. When a man allows himself to feel, when he stops running from his emotional landscape, when he begins to accept all of himself, even the parts he was told to hide, something begins to shift. Because true intimacy is not just about revealing the body. It's about having the courage to reveal the self, with flaws, with history, with feeling. Jung said, "The soul doesn't speak in words, it speaks in symbols, sensations, images." And few experiences stir the soul like the intimate encounter between two people willing to truly see each other, not just physically, but beyond the surface, beyond the roles, beyond the fear. When intimacy is lived with awareness, it becomes a mirror that doesn't flatter, doesn't soften the edges, but shows, clearly, what still hurts, what still hides behind that carefully rehearsed smile. It reveals what's asking to be held, not pushed away. And yes, that mirror can be uncomfortable, but in that discomfort lies the power to change. It's in that raw place where the masks fall off and the body becomes truth that many men finally realize just how far they've drifted from themselves. They see how hard they've tried to control emotions they never learned to name, how often they've used the body as a shield, not a bridge. And in that moment, when they're not just naked in skin but naked in soul, a new kind of truth begins to surface. But that revelation doesn't come from the other person. It rises from within. It begins the moment a man decides to let go of the act, to stop performing the role of the invincible, the untouchable, the always in control. It begins when he chooses to just be human, imperfect, contradictory, but real. And in that state, desire begins to shift. It's no longer a frantic hunger. It breaks free from scarcity. It's no longer about validation or conquest. It becomes expression of what's felt, what's known, what's shared. And that's where intimacy transforms. Intimacy, when it's truly lived, stops being a performance. It becomes a space, a sacred space, of listening, of reciprocity, of shared growth. The body becomes language. Silence becomes an answer. Touch becomes healing. And maybe the most beautiful part of all this is that such transformation doesn't require formulas. It doesn't depend on techniques. It doesn't rest on polished words or rehearsed scripts. It asks for something far simpler and far harder: presence, attention, the courage to look inward with honesty, and the humility to allow someone else to look too. Above all, it asks for a willingness to offer yourself moment by moment, breath by breath, gesture by gesture, until two whole worlds meet, if only for an instant, in shared truth. Because intimacy, when lived fully, isn't about control. It's about surrender. It's not about possessing the other. It's about allowing yourself to be truly seen. And for many men, that is a quiet revolution. Because we were taught to hold it in, to stay firm, to mask the pain. From early on, we were conditioned to believe that feeling too much was a weakness, that vulnerability was a kind of defeat. So we learned not to feel, to disguise fear with toughness, to bury affection beneath sarcasm, to hide our longing under layers of desire. But the body remembers. The unconscious always feels, and in the moment of intimacy, all that has been denied begins to surface, not in dramatic outbursts, but in gestures, in silences that weigh like centuries. The man who surrenders consciously in intimacy starts to understand something profound. His greatest strength isn't in how hard he stands, but in his ability to be whole in front of another. It's not the control of the body that defines his worth, but the courage to stay present, even when he doesn't know what to do, even when he feels afraid, even when he realizes there's nowhere left to run. In that moment, desire shifts. It's no longer a blind impulse, but a compass, a signal from the soul pointing to where something still longs to be touched. Every intimate encounter, lived with depth, becomes a kind of initiation, a passage from the old to the new, from the role to the real. And this journey, it can't be walked alone, because true intimacy is always built between two worlds colliding, challenging each other, reflecting each other. The other stops being an object of desire and becomes a mirror of forgotten parts of the self. What irritates reveals. What attracts reveals. What blocks reveals. Intimacy becomes a sacred field where the unconscious speaks without asking permission, where buried wounds rise to the surface, where ancient silent agreements come undone. And yes, it can be terrifying. But it's there, in that raw honesty, that the gold is found. That's where the soul begins to breathe. There's an archetypal force at play in this encounter, a dance between anima and animus, between inner masculine and feminine, between instinct and spirit. Jung taught that individuation, the path toward wholeness, begins not by denying desire, but by understanding it, not by repressing the impulse, but by diving into its roots. What is this desire trying to say? What is it trying to heal? What is it trying to remember? These questions are doorways. They open paths toward a sexuality no longer trapped in shadow, but bathed in awareness. And when that happens, everything changes. Touch becomes intentional. The rhythm of connection slows down. Even silence becomes saturated with meaning, because the man who finds himself in intimacy no longer needs to prove anything. He's not chasing the title of best or most desired or most capable. He is seeking only to be whole, and in that wholeness he allows himself to stumble, to cry, to not know, to feel pleasure, but also fear. He allows himself to simply be there fully without a script. And in doing so, he gives the other person permission to do the same, because now there's no battle, there's no power game, there's only reception, there's only presence. The body becomes a temple, presence becomes a prayer. This shift may seem subtle, but it is radical, because when a man begins to live intimacy with his soul, he also begins to heal. Old wounds of rejection, of abandonment, of not being enough, begin to dissolve, not because someone else finally saved him, but because he finally saw himself, finally accepted himself, finally touched himself with the same tenderness he always dreamed of receiving. And when that happens, desire is no longer about lack. It becomes celebration. It's no longer a search, but a meeting. And that's when intimacy stops being about the other and becomes about the self that reveals, the self that embraces, the self that transforms. True connection with another can only happen after one has truly met himself. And that meeting, as painful as it might be, is the beginning of freedom. The beginning of a love that doesn't cling to desire, that doesn't cage or possess, that doesn't demand guarantees. Only presence, only truth, only soul. Yet even on this path of self-reunion, there are moments that feel like nightfall. Moments when the chest tightens with an unnamed ache. The pain of not knowing, of not understanding, of not being what you expected yourself to be. But it's within that very void that something begins to take shape, because when a man stops trying to be what he was taught and starts asking himself who he truly is, he takes his first real step toward individuation. This journey isn't a straight line. It's not some glorious destination. It is a dense, symbolic, and soul-deep crossing. And when sexuality is lived with courage and awareness, it becomes one of the most direct paths through that inner terrain. Because the body remembers everything. It remembers the unloved moments of childhood, the shame of adolescent confusion, the unspoken pain, the losses, the silences, the betrayals. Every time a man was touched without presence, every time he remained silent when he wanted to scream, every time he faked pleasure while feeling fear, all of it stayed in the body. The body never forgets. And that's why intimacy holds such power. It opens doors the mind can't locate. It unintentionally exposes what still hurts. And at the Same time, it becomes the very place where healing can begin. But hear this clearly, that healing does not come from the other person. The other can be a mirror, a catalyst, a witness, but the transformation happens within, when a man decides he no longer needs to pretend, when he stops protecting himself from himself, when he dares to say, "Yes, I am sensitive. Yes, I am uncertain. Yes, I am imperfect." And within that imperfection, he finds his deepest strength, because strength, in the language of the soul, is not about hardness. It's about presence. It's the ability to feel without shame, to stand in front of your inner abyss and still choose to walk forward. And in this new form of sexuality that rises from self-awareness, pleasure evolves. It stops being only physical. It becomes the pleasure of being, the pleasure of seeing the other clearly, without needing to fix them, and being seen the same way, without needing to hide your scars or explain away your silence. This kind of encounter changes everything, because it's no longer a performance. It's an exchange of essence. It's vulnerability without apology. It's intimacy without power games, just truth, naked and shared. And to live this, you don't need to be perfect. You just need to be present. You need to listen, to look inward, even when what you see hurts, even when what emerges are old shadows, resentments, shame. Because it's only by embracing these hidden parts that they can be healed, that they can be integrated. Jung once said, "What is not made conscious will appear in our lives as fate, and often our most repetitive fates are born from our most repressed desires, our unlived affections, our silent cries, in conscious intimacy. Touch is no longer for conquest. It becomes a connection. A kiss isn't just impulse, it's language. A gaze is no longer about seduction, it's presence and silence. Sometimes it reveals more than 1,000 words ever could, because in that sacred silence, everything begins to rise, memories, longings, fears. And when two human beings choose to remain together in that space, to hold each other in truth, not just in pleasure, something rare is born, a trust that doesn't depend on guarantees, a safety that doesn't rely on control, but on the freedom to simply be, to be too much, to be not enough, to be human. There is something deeply spiritual in this experience, not in a religious sense, but in the sense of the soul awakening, because sexuality, when lived in this way, becomes a temple, not because it follows sacred rituals, but because every gesture, every breath, every moment of true presence becomes an act of inner reconciliation. The body becomes an altar. The connection becomes a prayer, not to a God outside of oneself, but to the being within that has waited so long to be seen. And so, little by little, the man stops seeking outside what can only be found within. He begins to understand that the approval he chased, the recognition he craved, were never about the other. They were calls from the soul, silent pleas to finally be seen by himself. To truly recognize yourself is to cross a threshold where everything changes. Intimacy stops being a place of lack and becomes a space of communion, where two whole beings meet, not to complete each other, but to expand together, where love and desire are no longer born from emptiness, but from the abundance of presence, of being whole, of being awake. And when that awakening happens, everything around starts to shift, because the man who learns to see himself begins to see others differently too. He no longer seeks a mirror to reflect back some idealized image. He's no longer searching for a shelter to hold his hidden wounds. He's looking for an encounter, not just anyone, but one where souls are allowed to show themselves, where love and touch aren't currency, they're care, where the gaze doesn't judge, it accepts, where the presence of the other isn't about need, it's about choice. In this new kind of intimacy, there is no room for the power games that once wore the mask of love. There's no more need for performance that numbs feeling, no more promises made without heart. There is room for discomfort, for the unease that comes from truly seeing yourself, for the silence that hurts, but also heals. Because only when you stop running can you finally start to listen, and listening to yourself. That's where real transformation begins. How many men live entire decades without ever being truly looked in the eye? How many learned to be desired, but never welcomed? How many were loved for what they showed, but never for who they were? That's why conscious intimacy is not always light. It is raw. It is intense. It is revealing, because it asks you to strip down, not just your clothes, but every single layer of defense you've built over the years. And only those who have ever allowed themselves to be truly seen know how terrifying and how freeing that can be. It's in this sacred space that healing begins, not the kind of healing that comes from the outside, but the kind that awakens when a man stops running from his own reflection. When he accepts that his story has flaws, scars, missing pieces, not to excuse his actions, but to understand them, to integrate them, to allow them to become part of something wider. Jung once said, "The process of individuation is becoming who you are. And to do that, you must let go of the ideal and embrace the real. Stop trying to be perfect and start choosing to be whole. And in this wholeness, there's room for everything: desire, fear, doubt, tenderness, strength, and vulnerability. Because the man who can feel all of this without shame is the same man who can with courage offer a love that doesn't demand, that doesn't trap, that doesn't control, but frees. In this love, pleasure doesn't need to be explained, it's lived. Connection doesn't need to be proven, it's felt. And intimacy becomes a kind of dance between two inner worlds, not trying to erase each other, but to merge, to elevate, to recognize one another. Because now, it's no longer about filling a void, it's about sharing a presence. And the more this man meets himself, the more he understands that his longing was never just for another's body. It was for something lost within himself, his sensitivity, his softness, his ability to feel without guilt. And suddenly, the other is no longer some imagined savior, but a companion, a fellow traveler, someone to walk beside, without needing to hide the weight of the journey. And sexuality, in this crossing, becomes something greater. It is no longer just release. It is no longer just ritual. It becomes an expression of a soul that has found home within its own body. A soul that has learned to touch without fear and to be touched without flinching. A soul that now knows that the deepest pleasure doesn't come from the outside, but rises from the inside. When the self recognizes itself, that's when intimacy transforms into a rite of passage, not a ceremony, but a ritual of the soul. Each encounter becomes a rebirth, a moment of shedding old skin, of making room for a truer version of self, not the perfect version, but the honest, whole, free one. And this man, now more present than ever, begins to walk with a new posture. He no longer needs to shout to be heard. He doesn't need to conquer to feel valued. He has learned to inhabit his own silence, to trust his own pace. And in that trust, he's discovered a new way to love, without fear of losing, without fear of not being enough. Because now he understands. What he had been searching for all along was never outside. It was within, waiting only for the courage to be seen, to be accepted, to be lived. And living that truth requires a courage that can't be taught in books or learned in speeches. It is the courage to feel, to let feeling lead, even when the mind wants to protect. even when old patterns try to drag him back to the automatic, because the body, when truly listened to, reveals old secrets. It shows where fear still hides, where shame still lingers, where the need to be loved at any cost still pulses. And in this deep, silent listening, a new way of being begins to emerge. The man who surrenders to this process is never the same. He begins to notice the smallest things, the impact of a glance, the weight of a word said in haste, the truth, or lack of it, in a simple touch. He begins to realize that desire is not linear, that it doesn't always mean what it seems, that behind a gesture of closeness may be a cry for care, that behind coldness there may be fear, that behind anger there may be a pain that never had space to be felt. All of this reveals itself when intimacy is no longer a performance, but an encounter. And the beauty of this kind of encounter is that there's no rush, no goals, no scripts. There is listening, there is space, there is a different kind of time, soul time. And in soul time, real transformation becomes possible. Because emotional healing, contrary to what many believe, doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in connection, in what Jung called a true relationship between two whole individuals. It's in this space that forgotten parts begin to wake up, not through force, but because once seen, they no longer need to scream. They can rest. They find a home. And when a man starts to live like this, he doesn't just transform himself. He transforms the way he relates to the world. He starts to treat others with more care. Not because he's following some rule book, but because he genuinely feels the impact of his presence. He feels when a word wounds. He feels when silence holds. He feels when an action pulls someone closer or pushes them away. And most of all, he feels when he's truly present, or just performing. This shift is not theoretical, it's not abstract, it is embodied. It's in the breath, in the gaze, in the way he touches and allows himself to be touched, because now his touch carries no rush, no hunger, only presence. And that changes everything. It changes how the other experiences him. It changes the relationship. It even changes the very meaning of pleasure, because pleasure born from presence is no longer just physical. It becomes a state of connection, a place where body and soul are no longer separate, where desire and emotion move as one. And so the man realizes he doesn't need to hide his sensitivity anymore, that it is not weakness, but language, that it doesn't make him less of a man, but more human. And this humanity, when fully embraced, becomes his greatest strength, because it holds his true capacity to love deeply, to commit to something beyond the immediate, to hold a bond, even when it's hard, to stay, even when it's scary. At this point, intimacy becomes ground. It becomes a harbor, a path of self-discovery. It's no longer just a place to chase pleasure or relief. It becomes the space where he is recognized, where he is healed, where he learns. And that doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually, in each encounter, in each fall, in each new beginning, because the conscious man is not the one who never makes mistakes. He is the one who learns from them, who looks at them with responsibility, not shame, who allows himself to grow from what once made him shrink. And perhaps that's the most beautiful thing about this entire journey. It doesn't demand perfection. It invites wholeness. And to be whole is to accept that we are made of light and shadow, of reason and instinct, of strength and fragility. It is to understand that desire, when deeply listened to, is not the enemy of the soul. It is its messenger. It reveals what still lives, what still longs, what still waits to be embraced, what still needs to be touched, what still asks to be healed. And when this man learns to read the signs of his own desire, he ceases to be a hostage of instinct and becomes a master of himself, not in the sense of control, but of consciousness. Not to dominate feeling, but to listen to it with respect. And in this respect, a new kind of pleasure is born, a pleasure that doesn't end in the body, but begins there and expands into the gaze, into conversation, into simple gestures, because everything becomes language, everything becomes an opportunity. For one to reveal oneself, and for the other to stop being a threat or a savior, and instead become a companion on the path, someone with whom one can share, not because one needs to, but because one chooses to. It is in this place that love becomes possible, not the idealized love, full of expectations and projections, but the real love, the one that sees the other as they are and still stays, the one who knows the shadow and still chooses to remain, the one who does not demand change, but inspires transformation because it is born from truth, not fantasy. And this truth is only found when one has the courage to look within, to bare oneself before the mirror of intimacy, and instead of fleeing, to stay, to breathe, and say with body and soul, I am here, whole, ready to see and be seen. To be ready to be seen is perhaps one of the deepest and most challenging experiences a man can live, because to be seen is not just to show oneself. It is to allow the other to touch what you most fear to reveal, to allow the other to approach where it still hurts, where shame still lingers, where a part of the soul still hides, a part silenced for years. It is in this moment, when the man no longer flees his own reflection, that something truly new begins to be born. Not a new identity, but a new relationship with who he always was. Conscious intimacy, then, is no longer a place of escape. It is a place of return. A return to what is essential, to what was forgotten, to what has always been there, waiting to be felt. And the more this man allows himself to be present, the more he realizes he doesn't need masks, strategies, or games to be loved. He begins to experience what it means to be accepted, without artifice, without defenses. And for those who have spent their lives trying to prove their worth, this is liberating, because the love born in this space does not demand conquest. It is born of presence, and presence only happens when there is truth. And this truth, no matter how frightening, is what heals the most, because it reveals that the fear of not being enough, of being rejected, of being abandoned, are shadows that only have power when they go unseen. And once seen, they do not disappear but lose their grip. They stop secretly guiding actions. They stop sabotaging encounters. They stop contaminating desire with need. And the man, by recognizing these shadows, begins to make different choices, choices born from consciousness, not fear. And in this space, the body becomes more than flesh. It becomes fertile soil. Each touch becomes a possibility, each breath an opening, not to empty pleasure, but to an encounter that transforms. And sexuality purifies, not in the moralistic sense, but in the sense of becoming more essential, more true. It ceases to be a territory of compensation and becomes a territory of communion, of sharing, of renewal, of unmasked surrender. And it is at this point that many men realize something they may never have spoken aloud: how much they long to be touched, not just in the body, but in the soul. How much they long to be seen without judgment, how much they yearn for a space where they can fall without being humiliated, where they can feel without being ridiculed. And when this space exists, even for a moment, the world changes, because the man can finally rest from the fight to be someone he never needed to be. He can simply be. And in being, he learns to love. Because real love is born only from freedom. The freedom not to know, not to control, not to meet every expectation, And this freedom is only possible when there is emotional maturity, a maturity not measured by age, by achievements or status, but by the capacity to be with the other without losing oneself, to listen without defending, to touch without asserting. Mature love is born. The meeting between two beings who see and accept each other fully, even if that encounter doesn't last, leaves marks. Because once someone has truly been seen, they can no longer hide from their own reflection. And once someone has touched another with presence, they can't return to superficiality without feeling emptiness. There's a kind of longing that settles in, a longing for what is real, deep, and whole. This longing becomes a compass. It guides the next steps, shows what truly matters, reveals what no longer serves, and points to where truth lives. Gradually, a man begins to build a new path, no longer based on performance, appearances, or external approval, but rooted in inner listening, true feeling, and the courage to be himself. This doesn't make him perfect, it makes him human, more human than ever before. Because now he knows he can fail, fall, feel fear, and still be worthy of love. He no longer needs to hide his flaws to deserve affection, nor strive to be accepted. He has learned to accept himself, and that changes everything. At this point in the journey, desire aligns with the soul, and sexuality becomes sacred, not because of rituals or dogma, but because it carries truth. Every intimate encounter becomes a chance to reconnect with oneself. Every touch speaks the language of the invisible. Every look confirms presence, listening, and surrender. This is rare, it's precious, it's transformative, and even if culture tries to push a man back into hardness, indifference, and disconnection, he no longer fits that mold. Once depth is experienced, superficiality loses its meaning. This man, now more conscious, present, and whole, brings this new truth to all areas of life. Friendships, work, family, and silence. He no longer needs to prove who he simply is, and by being because the man who reconciles with his soul shines. He leads without commanding, touches without hurting, and loves without binding. He simply loves with all he is, all he feels, all he dreams, all he was, and all he finally allows himself to be. If this message resonates with you, and you're ready to deepen your journey of self-awareness and connection, I invite you to subscribe to Unshakable Mind. Here we explore the paths of inner strength, presence, and transformation, one step at a time. Welcome to the community where true growth begins.